My daughter signed away my life while I was still breathing. That is the sentence I wish I had understood. The morning I found out my name had been quietly removed from the company I helped build, the home I paid for, and the family I sacrificed my youth to hold together. I was 62 years old when I learned that silence can be mistaken for consent, and kindness can be weaponized by those closest to you. Let me tell you how it began. I am Margaret Holloway. I was born in a house with thin walls and thick expectations. I learned early that good women smooth things over. We absorb, we endure, we do not make scenes. I lived by that creed for most of my life, too long as it turns out. My husband Richard died on a rainy Tuesday in early March, a heart attack in the shower. Sudden, clinical, final. 39 years of marriage reduced to a phone call and a folded flag I did not ask for. People tell you grief comes in waves. That is true. What they do not tell you is that betrayal often rides in on the same tide. At the funeral, my daughter Claire stood beside me, her arm looped through mine, her hand squeezing at the exact moments photographers raised their cameras. She cried, beautifully, controlled, performative. Everyone told me how lucky I was to have such a devoted child. I nodded. I smiled. I thanked them. Inside, something small and cold had already begun to settle. 2 weeks later, Claire invited me to lunch. She chose a sleek restaurant downtown, all glass and steel, the kind of place Richard used to say made him feel underdressed, no matter what he wore. She arrived early, papers neatly stacked, phone face down. That should have been my first warning. "Mom," she said gently, "we need to talk about the future." I remember the way she said future, as if it belonged to her already. She told me she had taken time off work to help handle things. Bills, legal details, business matters. "You shouldn't have to worry about all that," she said. "You've been through enough." I thanked her again. I always did. Then she slid a folder across the table. It contained documents I had never seen before. Corporate restructuring forms, property amendments, a revised will. My name was still there. Barely. As a beneficiary. A passive one. Claire spoke quickly, smoothly. She explained that Richard had always worried about me managing stress, that he trusted her judgment, that it made sense to consolidate assets, to streamline decision-making. She said words like efficiency and protection and legacy. I heard something else entirely. I heard the sound of doors closing quietly. "Mom," she said, "you'll still be taken care of. Nothing is changing for you day to day. Nothing. Except ownership, authority, voice." I asked her when these changes were made. She hesitated for half a second too long. "Last year," she said. "Dad and I talked about it after your surgery. You were recovering. We didn't want to burden you." I remembered that surgery. The way I drifted in and out of anesthesia. The way Richard held my hand and told me everything would be fine. I signed nothing. That was important. I signed nothing. I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and saw not the child I raised, but a woman who had learned to smile while rearranging the furniture of someone else's life. I told her I needed time. She nodded, relief flashing across her face before she masked it with concern. "Of course, Mom. Take all the time you need." That night, alone in the house Richard and I bought 40 years earlier, I opened a drawer I had not touched in years. Inside were old check stubs, handwritten notes, and a thin envelope marked in my husband's careful script. "If you ever feel pushed aside," it read everything twice. My hands shook. I did not sleep. By morning, I knew one thing for certain. My daughter thought this was over. She was wrong. And that was only the beginning. The first thing I did was nothing. That sounds passive, I know. But there is power in stillness when others assume you are weak. Claire expected tears, confusion, gratitude. What she did not expect was patience. For 3 weeks, I let her believe the silence meant acceptance. She began making decisions without consulting me, canceling meetings, redirecting mail, suggesting I downsize, casually, as if the word itself were not a threat. She even sent me brochures for retirement communities with names like Willowhaven and Golden Oaks. Places designed to make you feel gently erased. I thanked her. Again. Behind closed doors, I started listening. I pulled old files from the study Richard rarely used after his stroke. I found contracts with my handwriting on them. Investments made with money I earned before Claire was even born. I found proof of my involvement everywhere. More importantly, I found inconsistencies, dates that did not align, signatures that looked rushed, amendments filed without required disclosures, my name removed from board minutes during a period when I was demonstrably present, active, and capable. Someone had assumed I would never look closely. They were right. Until they weren't. I made an appointment with a lawyer I had never met. Her name was Susan Klein. She was in her late 50s, sharp-eyed, unhurried. She listened without interrupting as I laid everything out. When I finished, she leaned back and folded her hands. "Mrs. Holloway," she said, "your daughter has been very busy." That was the moment my grief shifted. Susan explained that while Claire had maneuvered herself into a position of control, the foundation was unstable. Consent was implied, not documented. Capacity was assumed, not verified. And the will, the one Claire referenced so confidently, was not as airtight as she believed. "You were excluded," Susan said carefully, "but not erased." I drove home in silence, my thoughts loud and focused. That night, Claire called. "I just wanted to check in," she said. "You've been quiet." I told her I was tired. She offered to handle more things. I let her. Then, a week later, I attended a board meeting she did not know I was entitled to sit in on. The room went silent when I entered. Claire's face drained of color. "Mom," she whispered, "what are you doing here?" I took my seat at the head of the table, the one Richard always insisted I take, even when I protested. "I'm listening," I said, just like everyone else. The meeting continued. Awkward. Strained. Numbers were presented. Decisions proposed. I said nothing. At the end, as people gathered their things, I stood. "I have a question," I said calmly, "about the revised structure." Claire met my gaze. Her smile was tight. "Yes, Mom?" I held up a document, one she thought I would never see. Why was this filed while I was listed as incapacitated, when my medical records say otherwise? The air changed. Claire opened her mouth, then closed it. That was when I understood something fundamental. This was no longer about inheritance. This was about control. And control, once challenged, does not retreat quietly. As I left the building, my phone buzzed with a message from Claire. "We need to talk. Now." I smiled to myself for the first time in months. Because finally, after years of being overlooked, underestimated, and gently pushed aside, my voice was about to matter again. And Claire had no idea how far I was willing to go. Claire arrived at my house that evening without knocking. She never knocked anymore. Not since she decided everything inside these walls belonged to her by extension. I heard the front door open. Her heels clicking across the hardwood floor Richard had refinished himself. The same floor she once spilled nail polish on and cried for hours because she thought she'd ruined it forever. Some things never change. Only the stakes do. "Mom," she said, standing in the doorway of the living room. "What was that today?" I was seated in Richard's old armchair, the one with the loose armrest I refused to fix. My hands were folded in my lap. Calm. Still. "Listening," I said. She let out a short laugh, sharp around the edges. "You blindsided me. That meeting wasn't for you." I tilted my head slightly. According to the bylaws filed with the state, it very much was. Her jaw tightened. "You know what I mean." I did. I simply chose not to rescue her from her own discomfort. Claire paced, agitation leaking through her practiced composure. "You embarrassed me in front of my colleagues. You questioned documents that were settled." "Settled for whom?" I asked. She stopped pacing, looked at me as if seeing me clearly for the first time in years. Not as a mother, not as a figure to be managed, but as an obstacle. "Dad trusted me," she said. "He wanted me to take over. He knew you didn't want the stress." I stood slowly. My knees ached. Age has a way of announcing itself at inconvenient moments. But my voice was steady. "Your father trusted us," I said. Plural. "And wanting peace is not the same as surrendering authority." She scoffed. "You don't understand how things work anymore." That hurt more than I expected. Not because it was new, but because it was said so easily. I walked past her to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. I could feel her watching me, calculating. "You need to stop digging," she said quietly. "You're going to hurt yourself." I turned. "Hurt myself how, Claire? By knowing the truth?" She hesitated. Just enough. There it was. After she left, I sat at the kitchen table until midnight, staring at the grain of the wood Richard had chosen because it reminded him of his father's workshop. I thought about the years I stayed quiet, the meetings I skipped because Claire said she had it handled, the signatures I didn't question because I trusted my own child. Trust, I was learning, can be a liability. The next morning, Susan called. "I pulled additional records," she said. "There's more. Some transfers routed through a shell company. One Claire controls entirely." My stomach dropped. "She's been diverting assets," Susan continued. "Not illegal in isolation, but combined with the misrepresentation of your status, it paints a picture of premeditation." I closed my eyes. I remembered Claire at 10, lining up her dolls and assigning roles. Who spoke? Who listened? Who got punished for stepping out of line? "What do you want to do?" Susan asked. I thought of the look on Claire's face in the boardroom, the flash of fear she hadn't been able to hide. "I want her to finish what she started," I said. Susan was silent. "I want her to believe she's won." When we hung up, I felt something unfamiliar settle over me. Not rage, not grief, clarity. That afternoon, I called Claire. I told her she was right, that the stress was too much, that I trusted her judgment, that I didn't want conflict. Her relief was immediate, almost offensive. "Thank you, Mom," she said. "I knew you'd come around." I smiled, though she couldn't see it. That night, I handed Susan the last piece she needed. A diary. Not mine, Richard's. And inside it, dated entries that named concerns he never voiced aloud. Doubts about Claire's ambition. Notes about safeguards he'd begun planning, but never completed, including one final line, written just months before his death. "If she ever moves without Margaret, stop her." I slept deeply for the first time in weeks, because now the trap was set, and Claire was walking into it willingly. The invitation arrived by email, a formal notice of restructuring, a celebratory tone. Claire's name listed first, bold and confident. Mine included at the bottom, almost as an afterthought. "Board confirmation dinner," it read. "Family welcome." She wanted witnesses, applause, closure. Perfect. I spent the week preparing, not for the dinner, but for what came after. Susan filed quietly. No alarms, no warnings. Just paperwork moving through the system like a current beneath still water. On the night of the dinner, I wore the navy dress Richard loved. Simple, unassuming. The kind of outfit that makes people forget you are capable of anything sharp. Claire greeted me with a kiss on the cheek. Her smile was radiant, victorious. I watched her circulate the room, laughing, charming, explaining the future she believed she owned. I watched people nod. I watched them assume. Midway through dessert, Claire tapped her glass. "I want to thank everyone for being here," she began. "This transition means so much to me. To us." She gestured toward me. "Mom has been incredibly supportive." Applause followed. Polite. Hollow. I stood. "If I may," I said. Claire froze for half a heartbeat. Then she nodded. "Of course." I took a breath, felt the weight of every year I'd been silent. Then I spoke. "I want to thank Claire for stepping up," I said. "Leadership is demanding, especially when built on assumptions." The room stilled. I continued, voice calm. "I recently reviewed some documents I hadn't seen before. With counsel." Claire's smile faltered. "And it appears there have been some misunderstandings about my role, my consent, and my capacity." I turned to Susan, who stood near the wall. "Miss Klein?" Susan stepped forward. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Earlier today," she said, "a temporary injunction was filed. Effective immediately, all asset transfers initiated without Mrs. Holloway's documented consent are frozen, pending review." Murmurs rippled through the room. Claire laughed, brittle. "This is ridiculous." Susan met her gaze. "The court disagrees." I looked at my daughter then. Really looked. "You thought I wouldn't notice," I said softly. You thought my silence meant surrender. Her face flushed. You're doing this here? In public? I smiled. You taught me the value of timing. Security arrived. Papers were served. Claire's hands shook as she read. Mom, she whispered. This isn't necessary. I leaned in close, my voice for her alone. You took what wasn't yours and called it protection. This is consequence. As the room emptied, Claire stood alone, surrounded by the future she'd tried to steal. And I felt something release inside me. This wasn't revenge fueled by anger. It was justice, delivered with precision. And it was only halfway done. The morning after the dinner, my phone was silent. No apology, no explanation, no rage-filled voicemail. Just absence. For years, silence had been Claire's weapon. Now, it was mine. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, sunlight stretching across the wood like it always had. The house felt different. Not lighter, sharper. As if it had been holding its breath and finally exhaled. By noon, the calls started. First from distant relatives who had attended the dinner and wanted clarification. Then from 2 board members who suddenly remembered my contributions and asked if we could talk privately. I listened. I thanked them. I said very little. Susan called around 3. She's retained counsel, Susan said. Aggressive. Expensive. They're claiming emotional distress, reputational harm, elder exploitation in reverse. I almost laughed. Reverse. They're also filing a petition questioning your capacity, Susan added. Full evaluation request. There it was. The move I'd been waiting for. I set my cup down carefully. Let them. Susan paused. Are you sure? Very. Because this was the line Claire could never cross without revealing exactly who she was. That afternoon, I drove to the old lake house Richard and I used to escape to when Claire was in college. It had been sitting empty for years, untouched. I unlocked the door and breathed in dust, pine, and memory. In the bedroom closet, behind a stack of blankets, was a small metal box. Richard's handwriting was still visible on the lid, for Margaret, if needed. Inside were recordings, old ones, audio files saved meticulously. Richard had started recording meetings after Claire began pushing harder. Conversations she didn't know were preserved. Her voice, her words. I listened to one file, dated 8 months before Richard's death. Dad, she said in it, frustrated. Mom doesn't need to be involved in every decision. She's slowing things down. You know she can't handle pressure anymore. Richard's reply was calm, firm. She built this with us. You don't cut her out. Claire exhaled sharply. Then maybe we need to frame it differently. Frame it. I turned off the recorder and sat in the quiet. This wasn't about money. It never had been. It was about narrative. 2 days later, I received the notice. Court-ordered evaluation. Comprehensive. Public record. Claire wanted me declared unfit. She wanted the final word. Susan met me outside the courthouse the morning of the hearing. She squeezed my arm. You ready? I smiled. I was born ready. I just didn't know it until now. Inside, Claire sat across the room, her posture perfect, her eyes hollowed by sleeplessness. She didn't look at me. The judge was thorough, questions precise, the evaluator clinical but fair. I answered everything. Dates, decisions, financials, memories. Then Susan asked to submit additional evidence. The recordings played. Claire's voice filled the courtroom. Clear, calculated, undeniable. The judge listened, took notes, did not interrupt. When it was over, Claire finally looked at me. Her face had changed. Not angry now, afraid. The ruling would come later, the judge said. But as we left, Susan leaned in. This didn't just neutralize her claim, she whispered. It flipped it. Claire had tried to paint me as diminished. Instead, she'd exposed her own manipulation. That night, I slept at the lake house. I dreamed of Richard, standing by the water, nodding once. Approval. When I woke, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. You think you've won. You have no idea what you've started. I stared at the screen, calm, because I did know. Claire was cornered. And people like her don't retreat. They strike back, which meant the real damage was still coming. The ruling arrived on a Thursday afternoon. I was in the garden, pruning roses I'd neglected too long, when Susan called. Capacity confirmed, she said, unambiguously. The petition was dismissed. I closed my eyes. And the judge flagged Claire's actions for further review. Financial misconduct, misrepresentation. There will be hearings. My hand tightened around the shears. Susan hesitated. Margaret, there's something else. I waited. Claire's attorney contacted me this morning. They're proposing a settlement. Of course they were. She wants to step down quietly, Susan continued. Transfer control back to shared governance. No admission of wrongdoing. Non-disclosure on both sides. I laughed then. A short, sharp sound that startled a bird from the fence. No. Susan didn't sound surprised. She's scared, Margaret. This could ruin her. I set the shears down, looked at the house, the garden, the life I'd almost been edited out of. She didn't worry about ruining me, I said. That evening, Claire came to my house. She knocked this time. When I opened the door, she looked smaller. Not physically, emotionally. Like someone who had been holding herself rigid for too long and finally cracked. Mom, she said, voice trembling. Please. I stepped aside. She walked in slowly, eyes darting like the walls might accuse her. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't sit. I stood. I was trying to protect us, she said quickly. The company, the legacy. You don't see how ruthless people can be. I see very clearly, I said. Tears filled her eyes. I made mistakes. No, Claire. You made choices. She swallowed. I thought if I handled everything, you'd be safe. Safe from what? From being irrelevant, she whispered. The word hung between us. I felt something harden then. Not cruelty. Resolution. You were afraid of becoming me, I said. So you tried to erase me first. She collapsed into a chair. I never meant to hurt you. I believed her. That didn't change anything. I walked to the desk and opened a folder. These proceedings will continue, I said. Fully. Publicly. I will not protect you from consequences I was denied. Her head snapped up. You'd destroy me? I shook my head. You did that yourself. She stood, shaking. You're choosing this over your own daughter? I met her gaze. I'm choosing myself. For the first time. She left without another word. 2 weeks later, the headlines broke. Internal investigation. Breach of fiduciary duty. Conflict of interest. Claire resigned before she was removed. Friends stopped calling her. Doors closed. I watched from a distance. Not with satisfaction, with acceptance. But then, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived. Handwritten. From Richard's former business partner. He wanted to meet. Said there were things I didn't know. Things Richard had planned. Things Claire had interfered with. I folded the letter carefully, because just when I thought the story was nearing its end, I realized something unsettling. Richard hadn't just prepared for my protection. He had prepared for Claire's downfall. And whatever he'd left behind was about to change everything. I met Thomas Avery on a gray Monday morning in late November. The kind of day where the sky hangs low and every sound feels muted. He chose a diner just off the highway, a place Richard and I used to stop at when we drove back from the lake house. That alone told me this conversation would not be gentle. Thomas stood when he saw me. Older than I remembered, thinner. His hair fully gray now, but his eyes were the same sharp blue Richard once described as dangerous when focused. Margaret, he said softly, I'm glad you came. So am I. We sat. Coffee arrived. He waited until the waitress disappeared before speaking again. Richard came to see me about 2 years before he died, Thomas said. He was worried. About Claire, I said. He nodded once. She was pushing too hard. Asking questions she had no reason to ask. Trying to move money in ways that didn't make sense. I felt a tightness in my chest. Why didn't he tell me? Thomas sighed. He wanted to, but he also wanted proof. And time. He slid an envelope across the table. Inside were copies of emails, transfer requests, meeting notes, all signed by Claire, all denied by Richard. She was trying to leverage company assets to secure outside investments without disclosure, Thomas continued. Risky ones. She wanted growth, fast. Legacy be damned. I flipped through the pages slowly. Each one felt like a small betrayal, precise and deliberate. Richard suspected she might escalate once he was gone, Thomas said. That's why he did what he did next. My breath caught. What did he do? Thomas leaned in. He restructured a portion of his holdings into a blind trust. Not for you. My hands stilled. For who then? For exposure. I looked up sharply. If Claire ever attempted to consolidate control without full consent, Thomas said, those assets would automatically trigger an audit. External. Independent. Unavoidable. I stared at him. She never mentioned this. She didn't know, Thomas said. Richard made sure of it. I thought of the recordings, the diary, the way Richard had looked at me sometimes in those last years, like he wanted to say something, but didn't. He was protecting you, Thomas said, but he was also protecting the truth. My coffee had gone cold. I didn't touch it. What happens now? I asked. Thomas smiled grimly. Now that Claire has already stepped into misconduct, the trust activates. The audit begins. When? He checked his watch. It already has. The words hit me harder than I expected. Not relief. Not joy. Finality. As I drove home, my phone rang. Claire. I let it go to voicemail. That evening, Susan called with urgency in her voice. Margaret, she said, did you know about the Avery Trust? I closed my eyes. I do now. Then you should know this, she continued. The audit is comprehensive. It will uncover everything, even things she hasn't been accused of yet. I thought of Claire as a child, scribbling plans in notebooks. Of the woman she became, hungry, impatient, afraid of being overlooked. She's going to be ruined, Susan said carefully. I sat in silence for a long moment. Then I said, this is what she chose. That night I slept poorly. Dreams of Richard, standing just out of reach, his face unreadable. When I woke, my phone was filled with missed calls. From Claire, from unknown numbers, from reporters. The story had grown teeth, and it was coming for blood. The audit moved faster than anyone expected. Within days, subpoenas were issued, bank records frozen. Claire's remaining allies began distancing themselves, suddenly unable to return calls, suddenly too busy to be seen in her orbit. I watched it unfold, the way one watches a storm from behind glass, close enough to feel its force, removed enough to stay standing. Claire showed up at my door again. This time, she didn't knock. She rang the bell over and over, frantic, desperate, her control finally gone. When I opened the door, she was crying openly. No polish, no performance. You knew, she said, voice breaking. You knew about the trust. I stepped aside, letting her in. I was done barricading myself. I knew Richard had plans, I said. I didn't know the details. She laughed bitterly. He always chose you. This wasn't about choice, Claire. It was about consequence. She collapsed onto the couch. They're saying I could face criminal charges. I said nothing. Why won't you help me? She demanded. You could stop this. You could tell them to slow down, to settle. I looked at my daughter, truly looked at her, stripped of arrogance and certainty. Because no one helped me when you erased me, I said. She flinched. I made one mistake, she whispered. No, I said. You made a pattern. Her hands shook. I was afraid, Mom. So was I said. Every day. I just didn't turn it into entitlement. She stood abruptly. You're enjoying this. I shook my head. I'm surviving it. She stared at me, searching for something. Mercy, permission, rescue. She found none. When she left, she took nothing with her. No anger, no threat. Just emptiness. A week later, the indictment was announced. Misappropriation, fraud, breach of fiduciary duty. Her name splashed across headlines that once praised her ambition. People asked me how it felt. I told them the truth. It feels like watching someone drown after they cut the rope themselves. Susan advised me to stay quiet, to let the process unfold, to protect myself. I did, until the letter arrived, hand-delivered. No return address. Inside was a single page, written in Claire's hand. I never meant for it to go this far. But if I'm going down, I won't be alone. My heart slowed. Attached was a copy of a document I had never seen before. A loan agreement, with my name on it. Forged, dated 3 years earlier. My signature copied well enough to fool anyone who didn't know me. The implication was clear. She was going to try to take me with her. I folded the paper carefully, my mind already racing, because this wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about survival, and I was done underestimating how far she would go. The moment I saw my forged signature, something inside me went still. Fear didn't rush in. Panic didn't rise. What I felt instead was a cold, focused calm. The kind that arrives when you finally understand the shape of the enemy you're facing. Claire wasn't lashing out blindly. She was calculating. I drove straight to Susan's office, the forged document folded neatly in my coat pocket. I didn't call ahead. I didn't explain over the phone. Some things deserve to be placed directly into another human's hand. Susan read the document twice, then a third time. "This is serious," she said quietly. "I know. If she files this as evidence," Susan continued, "she's alleging your involvement. At minimum, it complicates things. At worst, it exposes you to criminal scrutiny." Susan leaned back, eyes narrowing. "But you made a mistake." I waited. She underestimated how much proof we already have of her pattern. Susan pulled a file from her drawer. Inside were the audio transcripts, the diary excerpts, the corporate filings, the timing of transfers. A narrative was forming, and it did not favor Claire. "Forgery is escalation," Susan said. "And escalation changes the rules." I exhaled slowly. "What do we do?" "We let her try," Susan replied. "And then we dismantle it completely." Over the next few days, we moved fast. A forensic handwriting expert was retained. A digital analyst examined metadata. We pulled records from the bank that issued the loan. Nothing matched. The loan officer listed on the document had retired 6 years earlier. The branch code was outdated. The ink formulation didn't match pens manufactured during the alleged year. Claire hadn't just forged my signature. She'd been sloppy. The hearing was scheduled quickly. Emergency motion, limited scope. Claire sat across the room from me again, thinner now, eyes darting, hands clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. She didn't look triumphant. She looked trapped. Her attorney presented the document as evidence of my involvement, a shared liability, a mutual benefit. Susan stood calmly when it was her turn. "Your Honor," she said, "this document is a fabrication." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't dramatize. She dismantled it, piece by piece. Expert testimony, bank verification, timeline contradictions. By the time she finished, the judge's expression had changed entirely. "Ms. Holloway," he said, turning to Claire, "did you submit this document yourself?" Claire's mouth opened, closed. "Yes," she whispered. The silence was unbearable. "This court will refer the matter for further investigation," the judge said. "Submitting falsified evidence is a serious offense." Claire broke then. She began to cry, openly, uncontrollably. Her attorney placed a hand on her arm, but she shrugged him off. "I didn't want to go alone," she sobbed. "I didn't want to be the only one punished." The judge recessed the court. As we stood to leave, Claire looked at me. "You could have stopped this," she said hoarsely. I met her gaze. "You still don't understand." She shook her head. "This isn't about punishment," I said. "It's about truth." She was taken away shortly after. Not in handcuffs. Not yet. But the damage was done. The story shifted overnight. From ambitious executive under investigation to disgraced daughter who tried to frame her own mother. Public sympathy evaporated. And something else happened too. People started calling me brave. I didn't correct them. The criminal charges came 3 weeks later. Forgery, obstruction, fraud. Claire accepted a plea deal on the advice of her counsel. Reduced sentence, restitution, professional disbarment from corporate leadership roles. Her career was over. On the morning she entered her plea, I sat alone in my car outside the courthouse. I did not go inside. I didn't need to watch. Justice doesn't require an audience. That afternoon, I returned to the office. My office, the one I hadn't stepped into in years, because Claire had slowly made it feel like a stranger's space. The plaque on the door still bore my name, slightly tarnished, but intact. Margaret Holloway, co-founder. I ran my fingers over the letters. Inside, people stood when I entered. Awkward, respectful, unsure. I addressed them calmly. "There will be changes," I said. "Not out of vengeance, out of responsibility." They listened. I reinstated shared governance, transparency measures, oversight committees. Not because I distrusted everyone, but because trust, I had learned, should never exist without structure. That evening, I went home and opened Richard's diary one last time. I stopped at an entry I'd avoided until now. If she ever forces your hand, he had written, choose yourself. Loving her does not mean protecting her from consequence. I closed the book. The house was quiet. Too quiet. My phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. It was Claire. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know I finally understand what I did. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I typed back. Understanding is the beginning, not the end. I put the phone down. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the floor Richard had once refinished with his own hands. For the first time since his death, I didn't feel like I was surviving his absence. I felt like I was honoring him. But the story wasn't finished yet, because justice may have been served, but healing still demanded its price, and I was about to decide whether I was willing to pay it. Claire wrote to me once a week from the correctional facility. At first, I didn't open the letters. I stacked them in a drawer beside the phone, the same drawer where Richard used to keep spare change and paper clips. I told myself I needed time. That distance was healthy. That silence was earned. But the truth was simpler. I was afraid of what I might feel if I read her words. The first letter I opened came 3 months after her plea. Mom, I'm learning how much noise ambition makes when it's driven by fear. There's a lot of quiet here. Enough to hear yourself think. That's new for me. I stopped reading, not because it hurt, but because it didn't. And that frightened me more than anger ever could. Life outside continued. The company stabilized. Investors returned, cautiously at first, then with renewed confidence. The press lost interest when there was no more spectacle to feed on. Scandal fades quickly when it's replaced by boring competence. I took my place on the board again, not as a symbol, as a voice. People listened differently now, not because I demanded it, but because I no longer asked permission to exist in the room. One afternoon, Susan joined me for lunch. She watched me stir my soup without eating. You're wondering what comes next, she said. I nodded. Legally, you're clear, she continued. Professionally, you're respected. You could walk away tomorrow if you wanted. I looked out the window. I don't want to walk away, she smiled. Then maybe it's time to decide who you are now. Not who you were protecting. Not who you were reacting to. That night, I opened the drawer again and took out all the letters. I read them slowly, one by one. Claire wrote about the loss of routine, about the humiliation, about watching other women her age receive visits from mothers who still spoke to them with warmth. She wrote about anger turning inward, about fear losing its edge. In one letter, she wrote something that made my breath catch. I thought being strong meant never needing anyone. I see now that I confused control with safety. I folded the letter carefully. The following Sunday, I drove to the facility. The visit room was plain, sterile, designed to discourage intimacy. Claire sat across from me, thinner, hair pulled back without care for how it looked. She didn't reach for me. She waited. I spoke first. I didn't come to save you, I said. I came because I needed to see you clearly. She nodded. I deserve that. We talked for an hour, about nothing monumental, about books she was reading, about the weather, about how time moves differently when you stop chasing it. When the guard announced the end of visitation, Claire looked at me with tears in her eyes. I don't expect forgiveness, she said. I stood. Neither do I. As I walked away, I felt something loosen inside me. Not forgiveness, release. The first snow came early that year. I watched it fall from my living room window, the flakes softening the edges of a world that had felt too sharp for too long. The house was quiet, but no longer hollow. Silence, I'd learned, can be spacious without being lonely. Claire continued to write. I continued to read. Sometimes I replied, sometimes I didn't. We were rebuilding something, but not the old structure. That one had collapsed for a reason. At the company's annual meeting, I stood before a room filled with people who once assumed I was finished. I spoke about transparency, about accountability, about the danger of confusing loyalty with silence. No names were mentioned. Everyone understood. Afterward, a woman in her late 50s approached me. She looked nervous. "I thought I was invisible too," she said. "Until I heard your story." I took her hand. "You're not invisible. You've just been waiting too long for permission." That night, I returned home and opened Richard's diary for the last time. On the final page, he had written a single sentence: "Strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply refuses to disappear." I closed the book and placed it back in the drawer. Some chapters are meant to end. Claire was released 18 months later. She didn't come to me first. She found a small apartment, took a job that didn't impress anyone, learned how to exist without applause. When she finally came to my door, she knocked. I opened it. We stood there for a moment, two women, bound by blood and history and choices neither of us could undo. I stepped aside. That was all. Not forgiveness. Not absolution. Opportunity. Because revenge, I've learned, isn't about destruction. It's about reclamation. About standing in your own life again after someone tried to write you out of it. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been silenced, sidelined, or underestimated by the people who should have known you best, then you already know this truth. Justice doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it looks like survival with dignity. If you believe in stories where karma is patient, where betrayal meets consequence, and where women reclaim their power after 50, then like this story, share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe, because there are more stories like this, and they deserve to be told.